everyone. This is Shalini at UBC Press, and we are here joined today by Laura Bisaillon to talk about her new book, Screening Out, HIV Testing and the Canadian Immigration Experience. Laura is a political sociologist and associate professor in the Department of Health and Society at the University of Toronto, Scarborough. Through journal articles, scholarly blogs, documentary film, photography, and creative writing, her research investigates interactions between migration, health, and the state. She has held research fellowships at the Brochure Foundation in Geneva and the Netherlands Institute for Advanced Study in the Humanities and Social Sciences in Amsterdam. The research on which this book, Screening Out, is based on was awarded a Governor General's Gold Medal. So thank you, Laura, for joining us. It's great to have you here.
Thank you, Shalini. It's nice to meet you, and it's nice to be here as well.
Awesome. Yeah, so to start off, can you give us a general overview about your book?
Sure. So my book is an investigation of the Canadian immigration system. And so it is an ethnography, which means a detailed examination of how things work, like how things are done, how decisions are made, what happens, how things happen, where things happen, to whom and by whom. And so, yeah, it's an exploration of the system, and in particular, medical decision-making and legal decision-making and administrative decision-making about people living with HIV in particular.
Yeah, I had a chance to read part of your book as well, and it was really interesting to hear that you were part of community services as well, and that's kind of where you started off, and learning about these experiences of people who are going through the immigration process and the sort of medical screening that they have to go through. Can you tell us a little bit more about what made you interested in writing a book about HIV and medical inadmissibility in Canada?
I know it is a mouthful, right?
Yeah.
I stumble on it, everyone stumbles on it, medical inadmissibility. Yeah, so sure. So yeah, I mean, I'm now a university professor of sociology, but in a previous career, I was a community services worker, a social worker, really, in a community services organization serving women and women applying through the refugee system and the immigration system, and they were all living with HIV. And so this was in Montreal's East End. And so, and my role really was to help them in their first months and years in Canada, right? And so it was a sort of a troubleshooter. Actually, a big part of what I did was to accompany women to medical appointments, to appointments with lawyers in the private sector, and then in the legal aid system, to court dates through the refugee system, and then all sorts of activities through the AIDS service organization I was based at. And then I came to be close with many of the women, enduring friendships with many of the women, and thought sociologically about sort of, what was going on, and learned a lot alongside them about what people who live with HIV are facing as they arrive in Canada, and in the months and in the years after their settlement. So that was very eye-opening for them and eye-opening for me, and that's really became the questions that I had that emerged from that those sets of experiences, right? Like sort of problems that I saw people having that that concerned me, that troubled me, that certainly troubled them, that stayed with me. And then when I went back to do a PhD at the University of Ottawa, that those questions ultimately led to the doctoral project on which the book is based.
Right. Yeah, I was interested by the sort of juxtaposition of sort of this emotional relationship that you had with these women, and then also having this scholarly interest in that field. And of course, as well, the sort of the sort of starkness of what these women are going through with the sort of bureaucratic and medical background that it's all happening in as well. So I found that was quite interesting. So how important was it for you to write in this sort of narrative driven style about these medical and legal issues?
Yeah, it was imperative that I arrive at deciding to write the book in this fashion. So I guess I should say, so it's a book of, it's 284 pages, and it's composed of a preface, of a first chapter, of an introduction, actually, and then 3 substantive chapters, and then a conclusion, and of course references. And so the style that you're talking about is, it's a narrative book. It's a narrative driven, so story driven book. And so I bring the reader to have a relationship with a woman that I've called Martha. That's a pseudonym, right? And I bring the reader through her experience, applying to be a Canadian permanent resident from outside of the country, her discovery that she lives with HIV, and all of that, all of what then happens, triggered by her HIV positive diagnosis. So that's really the arc of the book is her application process, right? So that the sort of book follows Martha through. So I developed this relationship. I have a presence in the book. I'm narrating, and I'm also assessing, and I'm introducing analysis, but it's through the story of Martha and all that she needs to go through institutionally and bureaucratically and legally, and all of the immigration health work, as this is a term that I conceive and I use throughout the book, right? So the story of Martha and all sorts of people like her, because the research on which the book is based is based on 60 plus sort of interviews with people living with HIV, who most of whom were in Canada, but also then nurses and social workers and doctors, HIV physicians, and then this figure of the immigration doctor who does the medical examination, and then who makes up a medical report and then sends it to the government, and then the state then makes decisions based on the applicant who has a diagnosis that poses a problem to the government. And so it was very important that I write in this way. It was difficult to write in this way, to write a political story, but that's driven by humans, so that we keep first and foremost people's experiences, their bodies, their emotions, their struggles, their joys, their challenges, that we feel them, that we're aware of them, that we accompany really Martha in her interaction with an immigration doctor. So that's the way the book is sort of structured, right? Sort of this set of interactions between her and her immigration doctor. And then so it's a suspenseful book, in that it's only at the end that the reader learns Martha's fate. Is she successful? Is she denied residency? And so yes, so there's I have a presence in the book, as does Martha, and as does the analysis of all that is happening to her, because it's an institutional ethnography. So she's not the subject of research, but really it's an examination, and ultimately I offer a critique of the way things happen within the immigration system's medical program. And it's the first ever overview and first ever analysis of the medical program. I was speaking with bureaucrats from immigration from the immigration department before Christmas, right? The book came out in May in hard copy, and then it'll be launched. We'll launch it together right on December 1st on World AIDS Day. But in the revisions process, I spoke with administrators from the medical branch of the immigration department, and they confirmed, no researcher has ever taken interest in what we do or has never taken interest in this medical program. So this is really the first ever pioneering book of its kind.
Wow, that's fantastic. And I like the way that you've made this, as you say in the book, a human-centered study. So it is this very untapped sort of field, but you're also, as you said, like centering the human experience in that. And I think that makes it appealing to a wide range of audiences, right? So it's not just something that's going to be stuck in the scholarly field and can expand, because not a lot of people know about this, about our immigration system here, right? Everyone
No,
has
and
this
that's
sort of idea.
yeah,
Everyone is,
yeah.
Sorry,
Well,
I was just going to say, everyone has this idea of like the Canadian immigration system being very generous and easy to get through, perhaps. So this is a very enlightening topic.
Yeah, I think so what I wanted to do in this book and writing it as a human story, set of human stories, but analytic stories, right? That has a politic and it has an oomph, and it also links with the scholarly research, right? So I've written it not with references in text, but at the end, so that the as you mentioned, my intention here is my dream is to have the book read, right? Like perhaps authors, well, I don't know about other authors, but I mean, my dream in producing this book and working it up in a very readable and palatable way is so that it can be read, and it can be read first and foremost by the general public, so that the general public can once and for all learn about the immigration system's medical program from the inside out and from the bottom up, right? And can feel moved because perhaps they've been examined themselves, and if they've been examined and something has presented as problematic, well, they'll relate to a lot of what happens, right? Particularly, I mean, the focus here is on HIV, because that was my point of entry. But I've spoken to people in subsequent to the original field work, people whose families have been really impacted, right, damaged in ways by prejudicial ways in which they are typified as abnormal and then treated as such, right, through the files and medical decision making. So the politic here, my project was also to speak to a general public, speak to students, speak to practitioners who are in health and social services, speak to scholarly others, and speak to our students, and to demystify the immigration system and the medical program within that, right? And so I think this medical component within the immigration system is something that's, as I say, not been focused at all, like in the scholarly literature. Any analyses of the Canadian immigration system, curiously, don't include the medical part, right? And yet many Canadians or would-be Canadians have been impacted by the system. So through the book, the Canadian public and all the readers that I mentioned, like can know then about it, right? About the functioning of the system and how doctors and lawyers and administrators and community people's labor really is contributing to things as they happen, in particular problems that I unearth, right? So people are having certain experiences that are both good and bad, right? But I mean, the sort of the problems that people experience, I explicate them, I explain them, I describe them, I analyze them, and then I make a central argument, and I make recommendations, right, for change where prejudice and discrimination in policy, practice, and law are actually happening, right? So I think the readership my hope is that people read and they sit up and say, gosh, I never knew about any of this. And this is really stimulating stuff. And what can we do about it?
Yeah, absolutely. And the way you get there is through the interviewees, who are kind of the sort of central aspect of the book. And I was kind of struck by your approach to writing about them too. And the experiences that they have are so personal and sensitive, right? They discover that they have this life-changing condition through this immigration process. So how is your approach to paying respect to this experiences while you were writing? And do you still stay in touch with the interviewees that you spoke with?
Yeah, with many I do. With many I do. We developed relationships. I guess that was, many years ago now, sort of 15 years ago, right? So I did interviews and I did field work, like in institutional sites, such as at the Immigration and Refugee Board hearings, in lawyers' offices and doctors' offices. And so I guess in criminology, they call it, ride along, where maybe criminologists are beside, police officers in cars and things. So here, in my field work, there were no sirens and there were no vehicles. But I was inside of hospitals, of legal clinics, and in concert with doctors and lawyers and social workers who were very interested in the research, and in particular the analytic orientation, where the focus was on understanding and unpacking the institution of the immigration system, right, and how it works from the inside, as I said. And so the people that accepted to be interviewed with me, and the observational work that I did and the textual analysis that I did, like looking at the documents, their immigration folders and their immigration documents, and as well as those official policy documents that are available, and the and including some people I interviewed within the immigration department, and former employees of aid service organizations and former employees of the immigration system. I will say, everyone was very captivated by the particular line of analysis and the types of questions that I was asking. So I had a groundswell of people living with HIV in particular, very interested in taking part in the research. And that was heartwarming. And it told me that I was doing something right, or that I was doing something important. And many people had the idea that that their sharings and their experiences conveyed through their interactions with me could lead to changes where they had experienced problems. And part of what I do through this book, and that's what I say in the dedication, like in the acknowledgements, my first line is, I hope that Martha and others who live with HIV find that my analysis and my description of their immigration health work and their immigration application processes ring true for them. I hope that they see themselves in the stories that I've related. So I took, care to, I took care, like, I made some choices around language. Most of the research was done in French, actually, because I did research in Gatineau and in Ottawa and Montreal and Toronto, and then on the phone to some people who were outside of Canada. But so, UBC was really excellent through the copy editing, stages, and sort of respecting my wishes around preserving the language in which people spoke to me as a sign of respect for the people, but then the politics of language, and the sort of wanting to my readers to read read the work in the language in which it was being communicated to me, right? So where it was where in interviews or the interactions were in French, well, those precede the English, where I've provided the translation into English, for example. So that was terrific. That was with Anne Macklin.
Yes. Yeah, that really stuck out to me as well, the way that you kind of navigated these waters, because you are kind of sharing the stories of living human beings as well, right? So you have to kind of respect what they've gone through and then the way that they want to be represented. Yeah, and I thought it would be interesting to ask you, what's one thing that really excited you while you were writing this book? I'm sure there was many things, but what is one thing that caught your attention and kind of like set fire to your interest into doing this? And then conversely, what was one thing that you learned that was challenging about the sort of topics that you were writing about?
Geez, excellent question. The more I looked at the work that the federal, state, or the immigration department asks its contract physicians, 1,500 contract physicians, immigration doctors, as I call them in the book, do around the world, right? Like inside and outside of Canada. The more I looked at this figure and the professional functions and duties and responsibilities of this person in this particular role, the more I was troubled, and the more I was, intrigued, interested, and troubled by how our Canadian regime, immigration department is asking these physicians to work, right? So the way things are, the status quo as things are now, these general practitioners who take on as contractors the role of immigration, doing an immigration medical examination, which all people who apply to be permanent residents must go through, and they, in most cases, pay from pocket between $200 and $300, and those can be repeat fees because the results are only valid for a certain amount of time, and often immigration processes take a long time in terms of time and months and whatever. What I saw is that the way doctors are being asked to practice puts them in ethical, moral, practical, and professional binds ongoingly, unresolvable unless we take particular steps, such as those that I arrive at recommending in the conclusion, right? So there are problems that do cause harms to applicants, but also to doctors and lawyers and bureaucrats working within the system, or whose work tethers them to the immigration system, right, in one way or the other. And redressing as is necessary if we're at all concerned about the ethics of practice and the professions and harms that are systematically happening within our immigration system. If we're serious about changes, then dramatic changes do need to happen. But I question whether there's will to do this, because the immigration system is a massive source of revenue for all sorts of people, doctors and lawyers in particular, both inside and outside of the country. And I'm speaking here in those in private practice, right, which are actually most lawyers and most doctors, who are medical and legal entrepreneurs, right? So that's difficult. It's difficult to move the status quo. And so what I'm hoping is, by getting more and more readers to read the book, and because it's storied, it can be readable, and it can be readable over a summer holiday as opposed to a tedious academic book. But really, I was inspired by many other good writers who write political, narrative-driven stories. My hope is that many people read it, become bothered by the findings and the implications for us as Canadians, right? Let us learn about our immigration system and look look at this in a mirrored sort of way, and think about our society and what sort of what actually applicants to this country are learning about us and our institutions from outside of the country, because most people who undergo medical examination are examined outside of the country. There are about 950,000 medical examinations annually. So you do the math in terms of the revenue generated for this, it's huge, but there are a huge number of lives and families, because of course people immigrate to our countries in extended kinship relations. Of course, that's usually what happens, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, I love that you conclude the book with these sort of recommendations, and it's not just, you could have stopped it as, here is sort of expose or sort of narrative of what's happening, and you can do with it what you will, but you kind of extended that further by providing these sort of concrete recommendations. So without spoiling the end of it too much, can you give us some of the sort of ideas that you want readers to take away and then try and implement and change into the world?
Yeah, I think first of all is reading and reflecting on the findings, right? And reading and learning about the immigration system from the perspective of those who are undesirable. And that's an important standpoint, right? I mean, it is the case that, and why the focus on HIV was, well, that was my professional milieu and my professional universe and my friendship and professional relationships at a given time. But HIV within the immigration system is looms large. And that's another, tracking back to the previous question, like what was something that really surprised me. I was floored at the extent in terms of quality and quantity of institutional focus, guidelines, policies, directives communicated in the practitioners or the immigration doctor's handbook, but all sorts of places that there's an inordinate focus on HIV, and so an inordinate a number of opportunities for people with HIV to be othered and to be rendered abnormal and to be probed and probed and probed. And I think this is therefore the perfect health and social condition through which to examine the immigration system. So I hope people read. I hope they learn from what happens through the immigration system from this particular standpoint, right, of the undesirable, of the othered, of the person who's made extraordinarily visible, and therefore institutionally acted upon in extraordinary ways over time. It's to recognize the strength and tenacity of people who apply and who have HIV, and the extraordinary amount of work it is for anybody to immigrate, whether through the refugee system or the immigration system. But particularly this group of people with HIV who are have an extremely bright strobe light focused on them, right? And to learn about the impediments that are placed in front of people, and in both in the first chapter and in the conclusion, I cite the reviewers, some comments from the reviewers, as well as some colleagues from anthropology and sociology and also geography who had read the book and made comments about, from their perspectives of very schooled, schooled and to the PhD and beyond, and of the professorate, professional standing, had no idea about any of this within the Canadian immigration system. So their eyes were very open, and they were actually quite angered and incensed on behalf of applicants with HIV, but then also with disease and disability or other, because I arrive at sort of expanding beyond HIV, right? So yes, I don't want to disclose the ending because, as I said, it's since it's written as it's a piece of literary nonfiction, and so I don't want to disclose the suspense that we carefully built. And I say we because the peer reviewers were very helpful, as was the staff of UBC, right, at preserving the surprise. So I don't want to disclose the ending, but I will say that, I offer actionable recommendations, or recommendations that can be mobilized, as opposed, and I juxtapose that with a sort of maybe ideological types of claims making, right? This is the problems that I've unearthed and analyzed are based on empirical evidence, right? So it's from this very strong foundation I'm able to say, hey, there is the basis for a charter challenge, for example, to contest and challenge discrimination happening on the basis of health status, right? Challenging, of course, a lawyer friend. I organized a panel a month ago, actually, right on April 13th. It was sort of the first public event of around the book. It wasn't a launch, but it was a public roundtable with 3 scholarly colleagues, very widely attended, and it was virtual and it was in French. And one of the colleagues is a lawyer, and commented that this aspect of actionable change around charter is very interesting and very practical and possible. And then the other recommendations include specific changes to the way that the medical program within the immigration system is organized, and specific changes that can be done to practice to redress the way that actually doctors are being led to work in problematic ways in terms of their own profession, in terms of their relations with their patients that they're seeing through these immigration medical examinations. So those, so those are the recommendations that I articulate in the conclusion, and then that's the sort of culmination of the scholarly guidance and of the scholar activist guidance, the sort of actionable recommendations.
Right. Yeah, that's wonderful. Even just from reading it, I think like one of the key takeaways for me was, the existence of this issue, which as we've talked about, is not really discussed or known widely. And particularly that Canada is one of the very few countries that has this sort of mandatory HIV testing, and even one of the fewer that actually rejects permanent residency applications based on chronic illnesses or other conditions like this. Which is quite outrageous, so it, even just from as a regular person who doesn't really have any ability to change parts of these systems, it was very enlightening to me to read about these issues, and then also be emotionally sort of connected to people who go through this, this sort of process as well. So I just wanted to say thank you for writing this book, and having this sort of passion to bring scholarly knowledge into a more public sphere, so then we can actually create change out of that. I think that's a really important part of scholarship that perhaps is considered secondary to the actual research. So yeah, in closing, I guess, thank you for coming to speak with us here. This is a great sort of complimentary interview and conversation to the actual book as well. So it's wonderful that you took the time to speak with us about it.
Thanks, Shalini.
Yeah,
I know, I appreciate that, because I appreciate the interest on the part of UBC, right? It is true, right? I mean, academic books have a certain readership it's very narrow, and so the idea that we have in doing this shared experience here, where we're seeing each other, but then the listeners will be hearing our voices, is to bring scholarship to wide audiences, right? So that we can, in this case, know about a core social institution in Canada that no one knows anything about in detail, right? I mean, including ourselves who might have gone through the process, right? Our extended families, who are neighbors or our colleagues, or not thought twice about it. So that sort of this exercise that we're doing here really delivers on the promise of reaching broad audiences, to sell books, but to educate the Canadian public and publics beyond. Because of course the Canadian immigration system, right, has, by its nature, right, is directed to the world beyond Canada. I mean, it's new Canadians who know about, that have experiences through the system, and it's everybody outside of Canada who's not Canadian or Canadian permanent resident that studies the website or tries to make sense of things. So, the promise here is that the book gets to these audiences that are far and wide outside of Canada to help people understand, okay, how does this system work? And this book provides the answers to that, right? And I hope to secure funding to have it translated into French. So that's a project that I'm ongoing, that I'm investigating now. So thanks, Shalini, for your time, and to UBC.
Thank you.